This lesson, I'm going to be showing you how much fun you can have with variables. And of course, depends on what your idea of fun is, but there are some different options for variables that you should be aware of, such as declaring variables with let and const. So this is new with ES6, as well as different data types that are available within variables, such as booleans. So what a boolean is, it's either true or false. So it's just like the strings and the numbers that we've been working with in the earlier lessons when we're declaring variables and assigning values to them. And essentially it's like a switch. So it can either be on or off, true or false. So those are only true values that are available within a boolean. And a lot of times booleans are used for conditions. So they're ideal for conditions because you check to see if this condition is true. And if it is, then you run a set of code. So here we have an example of different data types. So at first we come in and we declare the variable, and we did mention that you don't have to assign a value, you can just declare a variable. So when we're doing var message, that's just declaring the variable. And in order to be able to use it, you need to declare it. If you try to access it before you've declared it, then you're going to throw an error. So at this point, we can message and we can see the value of message, and it's going to be undefined. So this is the default state when you are setting a variable. The data type is undefined. And undefined is kind of the same thing as null, but null is used, and that's another data type that you can utilize when you are writing your code, and that can distinguish and differentiate between undefined. So this is a variable that's been set to hold no value, and that's equal to null. And typically we can set to undefined, but we're not going to be setting it to undefined because that's going to lead to some confusion as the default is undefined. So when we want to use a boolean, so this is a great case for using a boolean. So we have our declarable, we set it to our boolean value, which in this case is false. And then we log out the boolean value. So we're going to see false in the console log. And then we update the mylight to be true. And then we check to see if mylight is true. And if it is, then it's going to output the message that's mylight. There's also, you can declare multiple variables at the same time. So we can do var and you can comma separate them. So you can have multiple variables declared at the same time. And then these are all going to be equal to undefined, just as we do with the one variable. And here's another example of the different data types that we've covered so far. So we have A is equal to hello. So notice the quotes around there. So that indicates that it's a string. B is equal to 10. So there's no quotes around there. That indicates a number. And C is equal to false. And true and false is a Boolean value. So again, no quotes, otherwise it would be a string. And you can output that value of A. So there are different variable types, and there's also different ways to declare variables. So along with ES6 came let and const. So what let and const do is they allow you to declare a variable, and this is scope based. So scope of JavaScript, and of course we are going to cover this in more detail later on, but for now it's important to understand that they're just different blocks of code that get run, and typically indicated by the curly brackets, as we see in the example over here. So the difference between let and const is that let is a value that can change, and const, as the name implies, is constant and is not meant to be changed. And var was the initial way to declare a variable, but now you're going to see that more and more coders are moving to let and const because of the control over the block. And essentially, if you have a variable that you are changing, then you create it as let. And if you have a variable that you're not changing, then you create it as const. And it gives you also more control when you are utilizing your code to make sure that you're not unintentionally changing a variable that shouldn't be changed. And that's where const really shines. And of course, more on scope later on in the course. So now with let, so really it is similar to var, except that it's scope based. And it's a better way to do things as you have more control over the variables. So here we've got an example of let, and really the same thing as when we're doing var, where we're assigning a value to it, and then we're reassigning a new value to it. Here we've got a code snippet that's an example of let, where we see we're creating a message. And this is an example of scope, and we are going to cover this in more detail later on, but we do have a condition to check to see if a value is true. And right now we've just defaulted it to true, so it will automatically run this code. And you can see that the message is going to be returning back, and you're going to see that we've got my message and then my message again, but these two values in the console come out different. So the first one that we're outputting is going to be new1, and then we're going to see welcome when we've got the second console message outputting the value of my message. So we see that within this type of format, we're using it within the block scope, and we are able to declare that variable, and then this variable is only equal to my message within this scope. And that's why we get the output of new1 and welcome in that order. So contrary to let, const, if we try to do the same thing as we did with let, where we've got the message, we're going to see that we're going to throw an error because const isn't going to allow us to update that variable value. And one thing to keep in mind is that you always need to declare variables before you try to use them. An example of trying to use const, and we see that it throws an error because it's not going to allow it to use const. The challenge for this lesson is to declare a variable called message using let, and then check to see if it exists. And if it doesn't exist, if it exists, then we update its value. And then lastly, we output that value into the console. So go ahead and pause the video and try this out, and I'll show you the solution. Set up a variable called message, and we can just leave a value of welcome inside, and then console log out the value of message. And you can see that we're outputting that value. And then we're going to check to see if message exists. And if it does, then we're going to reassign a new value for updated message. And then we can console log out message once again, so we can see that value. So let's try that out. And you can see we've got our initial message, and then we've got the updated message. And if we comment this out, we're going to see that we're trying to access message, but it doesn't exist. So we're going to throw that error. So if you do see this reference error, message is not defined, that means that we haven't declared message. And that's going to go through all of these. If we try to define it, then we're not going to get a definition for it. And you can also try to check to see if message is false or if message is true. And you can see that initially message gets output the Boolean value, and then we're updating it with the string value and also outputting it. And one other thing to note as well, that the Booleans and the numbers within Chrome, they show up blue, and the string values, they show up black. And you can also try that with const, so you can update it with const. And you see that when you try to update the value of message, then you're going to throw an error because this variable is a constant variable and it's not able to be reassigned. And even more bonus points if you tried just to declare the variable and tried to see what gets produced here. And you can see that we get undefined because there's no value for message. And even if we were to set message as equal to null, which was one of the data types, and we are going to be covering that in more detail, you see that this message still doesn't translate to being true because undefined and null as well as false, none of them are going to be translating into true. So this actually has to have true or contain a value to be conditioned as true, and then that's where you're able to update those values. Another thing too that you could have tried as well for even more bonus points, so I know there's a lot of bonus points being handed out in this lesson. So you can see that we've got our condition here. So remember, this is a block of code, so we're able to redefine let here, let message, and this will give us a value of message. So we just need to update this to be finally to be true, and then that's going to actually run this block of code, and you're going to see that this message is referencing a different variable than this message because over here we're able to update the value, and then over here when we're referencing it outside of the block of code, we're still seeing that initial value that we had set. So lots of bonus points in that example. And there's more on data types coming up in the next lesson. So do try this out and get comfortable with it, and more explanation coming up.